Hi, my name is Steve Rahi. I am a Premier Field Engineer specializing in system-centered technologies. Today's discussion will be a look at boundaries as they apply and function in Configuration Manager 2012. So, whenever you hear the topic boundaries, especially if you've been around the Config Manager product SMS 2003, 2.0, whatever, for any length of time, one of the questions you might ask is, why boundaries? Who cares? Well, you can see I'll answer that in just a minute, but basically this is the agenda that we're going to go through today. The introduction, which we're doing now, then I do want to go over the basics a bit, right? Because there are folks that maybe haven't been around Config Manager in 2003 and SMS 2003. I'm sorry, Config Manager 2007, SMS 2003, and so on. So I do want to set the basics in place in brief. But then I want to go into several scenarios where we actually see how boundaries operate, right? And see the boundaries actually in action. So the first question is, boundaries are familiar territory. Why do I care? This is boring. You know, what are you doing this for? Well, the answer is absolutely. This is familiar territory, right? For many of us, but for a number, it's new. And then even for those of us that have had exposure to boundaries for a while, there are some tweaks in Config Manager 2012 in terms of how they're leveraged, how they're configured, some of the strategies about them, and so on. Right? Much of the under the covers type of stuff is not all that different, but it's expressed a little bit differently, and so my job is to show that to you. Plus, if you've never seen the boundaries work and really kind of connected the dots on how the boundaries line up, and especially in terms of content access and so on, I'll show that to you as well. Right. So my job is to make this interesting to both those who have started fresh and don't really understand the nuances of boundaries, and then also to make it interesting to those that have been around a bit. So we'll see how I do at the end. Another reason that we talk about boundaries is because boundaries are absolutely critical to your environment. They are used to make sure that you have successful, predictable operations in several areas. Again, one key one is content access. We'll show you that in a minute. Okay, so why boundaries? Why do we really care? Well, I mentioned it already, right? They help organize your network, make your network predictable. But really, boundaries, their role is to carve up your network into manageable, predictable units so that you can have control over how Config Manager leverages your network and where traffic goes and some of those kinds of things, especially in terms of pretty network intensive operations, perhaps like content lookup. So boundaries are used really in two areas. One is client assignment, right? So whenever you install your client, if you allow the client to just go find the site that it's supposed to be assigned to automatically, then we will go use a number of different mechanisms to find which site server we should be assigned to. Now, you always have the option to manually specify the site, and that works fine, right? And then we don't worry, we just assign to whatever site you tell us to. But in those times where you want the automatic lookup and assignment to happen, then we do that. To me, client assignment is the least interesting of the two things that boundaries are helpful in. The other is content lookup. Right? So I'll talk about that more in a minute. But back in the client assignment world, there are three ways that, really four, because there's the manual method as well, but three automated ways by which we can find a site that we should assign to. The first is Active Directory, AD lookup. Right? So if you're going to if you're going to publish your boundary information, your site data in Active Directory, it will require that you extend the Active Directory schema, which is not a really big deal. Some environments don't want to do that, right? And other environments just are complex and don't want to extend AD, and there's no real requirement for you to extend AD. If you do, though, we will publish information about our infrastructure to AD that clients can then use to look up information, such as client assignment. We support both the local forest and cross-forest scenarios for AD publication. That's new as of Config Manager 2012, the ability to publish boundary information and such in AD of a remote forest. If you don't choose to publish to AD, or even if you do that and want to have other options, you can use a management point to look up what site the client belongs to. Now, you can specify the MP via command line. You can have an MP available in DNS lookup whatever, right? As once we find the MP, we can go through and validate that we're at the right site based on boundaries. Okay. The other really interesting thing to me that boundaries are used for is content lookup. So there are two roles that we really worry about in terms of content lookup. The major one is your distribution point. So when a client goes out and tries to find content, whether it be a package, an application, OSD, software updates, whatever, we have to locate the content, and the client can then access it to run, right? So that's going to happen on the DP. That's going to be a very frequent operation in most environments. So that's where we'll focus our efforts. Another, and we use boundaries to find what distribution points are available to us given our placement on the network, given our location around the network or even outside the network, right? Which we'll talk about that. Another item that we will support for content lookup is your state migration point. So that's an OSD specific item, and not all users in OSD even use state migration points. So it's not as impactful as a DP, but when you need to find a state migration point, you need to be able to locate one within your boundaries or serving your boundaries, and so that's another opportunity for content lookup. The third item you see on the line, I really probably should have asterisked, right? Because this is the management point is one that boundaries definitely do influence, but it's not one that's really looked up like a distribution point is, like a state migration point is. So we'll talk about that. I'll explain the differences as we go along, but that is one, again, that I kind of put in the category of content lookup because we do look it up in some scenarios. Now, in terms of boundary options, we have several types of boundaries. This has not changed since, as far as I recall back in the product. Maybe IPv6 has been, I forget when that was added. But regardless, we have 4 different kinds of boundaries. First is Active Directory boundaries. This is where you have a site, typically an AD specified, and every machine on that AD site is treated as being part of the boundaries, right? That are defined in that AD site. AD boundaries work fine. The potential challenge with AD boundaries, frankly, is it's pretty easy to end up with a boundary that changes over time. You have oftentimes different folks that manage AD, then manage Config Manager, and if they go and change the subnet association with the AD site, then we're going to possibly end up in an overlap boundary situation, which I'll explain more about what that is in just a minute. But AD works fine. The other thing that's a risk of AD, frankly, in large environments, I know of one environment where there are 4 hierarchies that are all running in the same AD forest. So if you were to try to publish all 4 of those hierarchies to Active Directory, it'd publish fine. But since we're storing subnet information and boundary information in AD, unless you know that you're not overlapping boundaries between various hierarchies, you could end up confusing your picture by that publication, because all clients will go to AD and they'll look up their boundaries and such, and that's how they'll operate. So it can lead to confusion if you don't have a clean, predictable set of unique boundaries, right? So IPv4, so we can specify IPv4 subnets, right, including subnet mask to carve up the subnet if applicable. We can also use IPv6 addresses, and then we can do IPv4 subnet ranges. So subnet ranges work great. In fact, they are oftentimes seen as easier to implement than trying to carve up your network into subnets and such. Sometimes subnets don't make sense because maybe you have machines that should be managed by one hierarchy on the same subnet as machines that should be managed by another hierarchy. A classic example of that is servers versus workstations. If you have a separate hierarchy for servers, separate hierarchy for workstations, and they are blended on the same subnet, then ranges help you address that because you can actually specify what subnets go where. Right? Now, in Config Manager 2012, it goes without saying, in most scenarios, you don't need to worry about the separation of server and workstation. You can manage them all in one hierarchy now. It's very technically doable. The technical limitations that cause the separation historically just don't exist in 2012. Yet some folks still do that, right? So that's another reason. So whichever way you go, we're going to have to specify boundaries. I'll show you that in a minute. All of this that I just talked about is not new. This has been around since as long as I can remember. Certainly since SMS 2.0, much of it has, right? There are, though, a few new twists in 2012. So one of the things that's new, in previous versions of Config Manager and SMS, as soon as you added a boundary to the mix, it became immediately active, meaning clients could use it for assignment, clients could use it for lookup and different things. Now, with Config Manager 2012, whenever you add a boundary to the list, it doesn't do anything, right? All it is really a library of information. The way you make a boundary actionable is by associating it with this new thing called a boundary group. All right. Here's another twist, and you'll see it in a minute in the console. In previous versions of Config Manager, whenever you defined a boundary, it actually would be listed as associated with a given site. That's not the case anymore. Boundaries are implemented per hierarchy, not per site. Right? We manage per hierarchy in Config Manager 2012, not per site in 2012. So the boundaries flow along with that. So back to the boundary groups. So you associate boundaries with boundary groups, and then those boundary groups are used to help control how content lookup works, how client assignment works, and things like that. Basically, boundary groups make boundaries actionable. So boundary groups, again, have some interesting things about them, but when you boil it all down, really, boundary groups basically enable protected DPs that have really been around since SMS 2003, Config Manager 2007 days, right? So protected DPs are nothing new. We've always had the ability, for a long time, we've had the ability to specify a given distribution point as protected, which means that only clients that are in the within the boundaries list that are associated with that DB could actually access them. That was a tool that would allow you to, again, very specifically define how traffic would flow on your network whenever deploying content, right, to clients. Well, for whatever reason, that wasn't something that was used a ton. At least in my experience, it wasn't used a ton by our customers. So now, because of the advantages of it, we kind of put that as the default. So every distribution point that you put in place and associate with a boundary group is by definition protected. Again, I'll explain that a bit more as we go along. So, and then in terms of boundary groups, they do other things like allowing you to configure whether a given boundary area is fast or slow, or things like that. Now, another interesting twist. So historically, through the time that boundaries have existed, you've always heard us say, do not overlap boundaries. Absolutely true. Boundary overlap is not supported historically. It's still not supported for client assignment. But it is absolutely supported and probably will be very common in some scenarios to overlap boundaries for the purpose of content lookup. All right. So all this conversation is good. Now let's just turn our attention to taking a look at this live in the console. So let me pull in my lab here. There we go, and let me go ahead and launch the console's open. All right, good. So I'll start with boundaries and boundary groups. So here in my console, under the administration node, I have 2 IP ranges listed. This is a very simple lab, right? So not a lot of complexity. In production, you very likely will have many more boundaries than this. So you can see that the first boundary is assigned to site PR1, or is for use with site PR1. And the second is for use with site PR2. Now, I just told you that boundaries are not tied to sites any longer. Well, and you see the site codes here. Notice it's a description field. I put them there just so I know where they're going. There's no other indication here that says these boundaries are associated with a given site. Right? You can use them at any site in the hierarchy, and you'll see me do that. So another thing here is boundary groups. So again, the boundaries by themselves don't do anything. It's the boundary group that makes the boundaries actionable. So what I have here is 2 boundary groups, one for PR1, one for PR2. Again, very simple lab. In production, for even a single site, very likely, most probably, you will have multiple boundary groups. Okay. So if I just go into the properties of the PR2 boundary group and look, the first thing I have to input when I'm defining the boundary group is what boundaries I want to include in this boundary group. In other words, I want clients that are on these boundaries to be controlled by the settings that I'm going to implement in this boundary group. Right? Now, what settings am I going to implement in the boundary group? That is under references. So you notice that there are two things that a boundary group can do: site assignment and content location. Right? You can do both or either. Right? So in my case, I'm doing both. In production, recommendation is to have separate boundary groups for content location and site assignment. Right? Let me explain that. So here, I know that any client that shows up and has membership in this boundary range, I want to be assigned to PR2. Very simple lab. Works fine. I also know that the only distribution point available on PR2 is this one. Right? Well, that's not likely going to be how you run in production. It may be, right? It may be. If you are this simple, then having a single boundary group is probably fine. But if you have multiple sites in your environment, if you have multiple distribution points in your environment, what you're going to want to do is have a certain set of boundary groups that define where clients assign. Right? So in my case, I would have a separate boundary group for PR2 assignment, PR1 assignment. And then I would have a separate set of boundary groups that define where the distribution points are in the boundaries that they're on to define client access. So if I had 15 distribution points, it's very unlikely that you would want all of your clients in your environment to just randomly hit those 15 distribution points. You might want to say clients in region in the West region hit these 4. Clients in Central or South Central hit these 2, or North Central hit these 3, right? Boundary groups enable you to carve that up. So when clients show up in the boundaries of South Central, they know which distribution points can service them. Again, protected distribution points are the default. Clients won't go to distribution points by default outside of those that are available by boundary group membership. All right, more on that in a minute. You'll see how that works. All right, so another thing that boundaries... Oh, and let me show you while I'm here, because I forgot to do that. Notice that here is where you specify the connection for your distribution points that are in this boundary group. Is it fast connected? Is it slow connected? That brings up some interesting possibilities. In some cases, you could have a mix. You could have 4 or 5 distribution points, 3 of which are connected by fast links, 2 are connected by slow, and that's fine, right? We'll figure out how to handle them appropriately. Okay. In fact, you'll see a setting about slow versus fast and boundary groups and such coming up that I'll point out. Okay, the other thing to show you here is publishing to Active Directory. If you do choose to publish to Active Directory, where do you do it? Well, where you do it is under Sites. So if I go to my CAS and go to Properties and go to Publishing, here's where I just simply place a check mark and publish to AD. When I publish to AD, it creates a systems management container and publishes my site information there. In fact, let me just show it to you real quick. Oops. There we go. So I have to have the view set appropriately so that I can actually see the container, but here it is. So the system management container, the view settings set to advanced features, and this is my information for my sites that I'm publishing to AD. And you notice that I have all 3 of my primary sites. Again, you don't have to do this. You can if you want, but you don't have to in many cases. All right. Now, I also mentioned you can enable crossed forest publishing. You can absolutely do that. The way you do it is there's a new discovery method called Active Directory Forest Discovery. So the first thing is we have to find all of our forests that we could publish into. Once we find the list, then we can choose to publish to them or not. Here, let me go down to, where is it? Active Directory Forests. I just have the one. I can go to, and I would have more than one. If I had more than one and had discovered them, they would be in the list. I can go to the properties and say, publish which site. So it might make sense to publish all, might make sense to publish 1 or 2 or whatever. Right? So that's how you do it. All right, so let's pull the lab back out and go back in and continue for a minute. So still on the basics. So we've talked about the purpose of the boundaries. We've talked about boundary options, few twists. Now the question, do you really need to worry about boundary configuration? Can you run totally without boundaries? Well, yeah, you could, right? But you really shouldn't, because without boundaries, it's just a free for all, right? Um, Boundaries allow you again to control. Well, without boundaries, hang on. Without boundaries, it's a free for all, and it may not even work because again, the default is to look for matching boundaries and to find those distribution points and such that are local to us and to run. So if you choose to run without boundaries altogether, you're going to be in what's called a fallback mode. I'll explain that more in a minute. And it will be less control over your environment and ability to segment the network. So really, running without boundaries is not really a good idea. You really need to invest the time to get the boundaries and boundary groups correct, right? Well, what about if you have a single primary site? You don't have to worry about client assignment, but you have a single primary site. Well, in that case, then it's going to be easy because you have a need for just one boundary group that will support client assignment, and you put all your boundaries in there. But you still want to carve up your environment in terms of content lookup, most likely. I mean, if it's a scenario where you have one primary site and there's one DP, like I said, yeah, you can get by with one boundary group, but you still need that boundary group. If it's a scenario, one primary site and those 15 DPs, you're going to likely have multiple boundary groups for the various DPs, arranging them by boundary and so on, right? So again, the recommendation is one boundary or one set of boundary groups for client assignment, another set of boundary groups for content lookup. The reason being, with client assignment, it's not supported to overlap boundaries. If you're in a single primary, no big deal. Just create the one boundary group and put the boundaries in and go for it. If you're in a hierarchy, then you'll need a boundary group for each primary site for associating boundaries for client assignment, and off we go. Then you have a separate set for content lookup, and that allows you to carve up the network, specify where DPs are, and all of that, even for a primary site or across a hierarchy. All right, so what about the condition where you have universal high-speed DP to client communication? You don't worry about slow links. You want to treat every DP as equal to the others and let clients just randomly pick. Well, if you want to do that, you can, right? I still would put boundaries in there just to have them in case you need to expand later. You want to put some additional control in there later. But you're starting to argue out of needing boundaries in that case. But most folks don't have that, right? They do want to control where things go and how information is sent across their environment. The last consideration is branch cache. What about those environments who leverage branch cache or Adaptiva or 1E Nomad or similar, right? Technology that allows you to look within your subnet for peers that have content versus going to the distribution point. So the way this works in general, certainly for branch cache, is when you have a client that's on a subnet range, right, or a subnet boundary, when you have a client that is on an existing subnet in your environment and the client needs content, well, the first thing it's going to do is look to see if any of its peers on that same subnet have the content or have part of the content. If the answer is yes, and the switches are set in policy and such to make it happen, then the client just goes to its peer and starts pulling down the content, which is really cool because it really reduces the load on your DPs and has a pretty significant impact on reducing the number of DPs that you need in your environment. But if the client asks on its network and doesn't on its local subnet and doesn't have anyone that has the content, then it's going to go across to the DP because it has to download the content. Now that it has it, the peers on its own subnet can ask it, and it will serve the content, right? Branch cache is a pretty cool thing, more detailed than I can go into here, but certainly something worth considering. Adaptiva, 1E, Nomad, also products that you can look at if it makes sense. If you have the branch cache scenario, I know of customers that run completely in fallback mode. It's fine to do it there because you don't expect the load on your DP to be that significant. You don't expect clients to be coming across the network in great number to retrieve content because they should get it from their peers, right? So in that case, again, a few tweaks that you'll need to make. You'll definitely need boundary groups and so on, or at least a couple, but not that many, and you'll be running in fallback mode most likely. All right, so that's the basics. Now, on to boundary scenarios. So there's, again, two things that boundaries do. So client assignment, content lookup. We'll spend a short amount of time looking at client assignment just very briefly again for completion. The big thing that we'll look at is content lookup. So there are several different scenarios. First is the concept of a fallback DP. Okay, let me explain that, and then I'll show it to you in action. A fallback, so I mentioned already that the default usage of boundary groups is to enable what essentially is protected DPs. So clients on a given boundary know that a certain subset of DPs are the ones that they should go to try to service the content. No, that scenario, that protected DP scenario, is really called in 2012 a preferred DP scenario. The DPs that are in your boundary group, you prefer to use them versus going elsewhere, right? Well, what if you're in a scenario where either the distribution points that are preferred to you, meaning they're in your same boundary group, either those distribution points don't have content, or maybe you are on an IP address or some network location that is not covered by a boundary group. Maybe a hotel room where you're connecting in, and the IP address information that you have either through your VPN concentrator or however, it's not defined in your environment, your config manager environment. So in that case, you are in what's called fallback mode because you don't have any boundary groups that you match, right? When you have a client that does not fall within the boundaries defined by any boundary group, by definition, it is in what's called fallback mode. So in fallback mode, you have a decision to make, whether or not you want to serve content to those clients regardless, or whether you want to prevent content from going to those clients until they are back within a known boundary, right? Back within the confines of a defined boundary group. And I'll show you how that works and where you can make some of those decisions, right? Another scenario is this thing called distribute on demand. So distribute on demand defines a scenario that really we first introduced with branch distribution points in Config Manager 2007. Now we've extended to traditional distribution points because branch distribution points are gone. Distribute on demand is that scenario where a client finds itself in the boundaries of a given boundary group. Maybe it's a traveling client, right? And you really never intended to push the content down to the distribution points now defined in the boundary group the client's associated with, but you did want to make it available for on-demand deployment if you have roaming clients, right? So in this scenario, the client would go and try to run the content because it's within confines of a boundary group, but those DPs don't have the content. So you would enable the scenario where when the request is made and the answer comes back no, that you would trigger distribution of the content to the distribution point on demand based on the client asking for it. And then when the client goes back and re-asks for it, hopefully it'll be there, right? So I'll show you that one as well. Then, again, we talked about boundaries per hierarchy, not per site, and we talked about, I used the term roaming, I believe, already. Roaming is not something you're going to hear, really, in Config Manager 2012 terms, but what you're going to see operate in the fallback scenario, distribute on demand, those kinds of things, really, those do pull in some roaming scenarios, right? One is the fallback scenario where you have a client traveling to a peer site or another site in your hierarchy within the boundary group there. It's kind of local roaming or global roaming or whatever the terms were back then, global, local, some combination of the two. When you have the hotel scenario, it's the equivalent of remote roaming, right? But again, the terms aren't the same, but for those that are familiar with that from previous versions of Config Manager, there's some familiarity there and some consistency there, right? So now, in terms of what we want to look at, there are a few demos that I want to do. The first, I want to show you verbose and debug logging because without verbose and debug logging, some of the detail that I'm going to show you in the demos, you just can't see, right? So I'm a big fan of verbose and debug logging. You'll hear other people that debate that, but to me, it's a very valuable thing to have turned on, especially since you can't see some things without it, especially in the realm of content lookup. And if you are running into an issue, it's easier to have it than try to reproduce it. Sometimes it's not as easy to reproduce. The next thing I want to show you is client assignment. Again, very briefly, just for completion, how the client goes and looks up its site if you don't specify it manually. Then we'll spend most of our time on content lookup. We'll go through several scenarios: basic, content lookup, the fallback scenario, content lookup, and then distribute on demand. And then finally, I want to end up just briefly touching on boundaries and MP lookup, how they impact. So let's just go over to do verbose and debug logging, and I'll pull my lab back in. All right, let me pull in my client. So I've got everything set already for verbose and debug logging. Let me get this set already. The way you enable it, you can do it on the command line if you want to do it universally, or you can go to the registry and enable it manually. So here, notice where I'm located. It just opened up directly to the location. If I go to CCM, HK Local Machine, Software Microsoft CCM logging, then I have an @global key. In the @global key, there's log level, and by default, it's set to 1. 1 means non-verbose logging. If you want to turn on verbose logging, turn this to 0. Right? In addition to this, you'll need to enable debug logging. So debug logging is down a bit. This is a key that does not exist by default. You have to create it. And then create a value enabled, regsz, and set it to true. Once you do that, verbose and debug logging kick in. There's no need for a service restart, no need for a reboot or anything else. It just starts working, right? So yeah, I mean, it's something you can enable on the fly when you need it, turn it back off. You know, the concern oftentimes expressed is, well, we don't have enough disk space, or we don't want to slow down the system, and, you know, valid concerns. But in most systems today, you have a far and above more disk space than you'll ever use. And so here, you can consume the disk space and even add some additional historical logs to retain more information, you know, and go from there. And that's worth pointing out, right? When you enable verbose and debug logging, you're going to get more data in your logs. So you might want to increase the number of historical logs you keep, or increase the size. I would generally lean toward increasing the number of historical logs that you keep, right? That way you have more of a complete conversation in there, and you can judge what setting to use, how many to keep. In terms of the system slowing down, it will. I mean, it's going to be doing some extra work, so by definition, it's going to slow down a little bit. But I've never seen it be a perceptible difference on a system. Most modern systems today, all the ones that I've ever seen, just aren't impacted by it. You have the user can't see anything, right, and know that the logging is getting written. So again, that's where you turn it on, and it's up to you whether you turn it on and use it. Last thing I'll say here. This is where you turn on verbose and debug logging on the client. In order to see the complete conversation, you will also want to enable verbose and debug logging on the management point. And it's done the exact same way, right? Exact same way in locations in the registry. Now, so let's move on. Pull the lab back out for a minute and talk about client assignment. So let me show you this real quick. So client assignment is something that happens when the client first installs, you know, big surprise. Right? And it doesn't happen again until manual interaction or manual intervention takes place. Let me explain it. So when you assign a client, when a client installs and becomes assigned to a site, it will forever and ever remain assigned to that site until some sort of external influence causes it to reassign. That external influence could be a client reinstall. It could be a script that reassigns it to a site. It could be a registry change. It could be whatever, right? But the point is, Config Manager Client on its own will never change its site assignment once established, right? So let's look at how the client assignment works. And again, this is in brief. I've just copied off some client logs here whenever we did the assignment, just so we could see it. And there are a couple of key logs that are involved in assigning the client. So the first thing is client location. I'll open this one up and show you the line where you see it assigning. Right? Here we're assigning the client to site PR2. But there's a process that goes on to make the decision to assign the client to site PR2, and that's captured in location services. So let me just show you this real quick. Sorry. Assigning client to site. I'll look for that in a minute. So I'm going to look at location services and client location together. So I want to open up these logs, right? Here's the right folder. So I'm going to go to client location right here. Then I'm going to scroll down and get location services right here. And I'm going to highlight both together, select to merge these files, and hit OK. what's going to happen is we are merging both of these together. So I know the assignment action took place in client location, so I'm just going to find that. So I'm just going to look for assigned right there. Keep going. Almost there. Should have searched for the whole string. Okay, there it is. So assigning client to site PR2. That's what I saw in client location. That's the first entry for client location in the log. The only thing I want to show you, I mentioned that the client goes through a process of querying AD, querying for its management point, looking for its management point in DNS to know where to go to look up client assignment. Here you see that. We're trying to retrieve MPs from AD. I don't have any MPs in AD. Attempting to retrieve MPs from DNS. I can use the default suffix here. I found a DNS record and I'm good, right? Looking at look up management points from DNS, I've got a name. So we found one. So this is the MP. Okay. From there, now that I have an MP, I'm going to go retrieve the site assignment from those MPs. There's another little process that kicks in there, but the ultimate result is we're going to assign the client to our site, and off we go from there. Right? Not a complicated thing, but definitely something that is related to boundaries, because boundaries help us decide, or decide for us, what site to assign to. That's why we don't want overlapping boundaries for client assignment, because then the client would not necessarily assign to the site that you want. It would pick the first one it matches and assign there. Right? And you actually might want it to assign to the second one in the list. All right, so that is client assignment. Again, not a big deal, and it's pretty basic, but I did want to show that for continuity. So let me minimize this and pull the lab back out. All right, the next set of demos I want to do is content lookup. We'll spend some time here. So we'll do 3 demos. The first is a basic deployment, then fallback, and then distribute on demand. So to understand kind of what's going on in the lab, you kind of have to understand how the lab is configured. So here is my lab. I have a CAS and 2 primary sites. PR1 has a DP installed and also has as its boundary this range configured in the boundary group. PR2 also has a DP assigned and has in its boundary group this range configured as its boundary. The client is assigned to site PR2 and its IP address is right here, which falls right in the middle of this boundary range. So by definition, this client is a member of the boundary group defined on PR2, right? Because it has this range. I'll remind you of that when we get into the lab. So when I run my deployment, we go and look up our distribution point, and we find it based on boundary group membership matching this range, and we should use this DP for pulling down content. The only reason that that would fail is if the content we're looking for is actually not on this DP, which would then either introduce maybe distribute on demand scenarios, fallback scenarios to go elsewhere, that kind of thing. But in a basic scenario, it should just stay within its home DP list and pull it down, and that's what I'll show you first. So let me pull my lab back in, and I will go back into the administrator console just for a minute to show you the boundary group configuration as a reminder. So here are, let me go up a bit. Here's the boundary group, here's the PR2 boundary group, and just as a reminder for continuity with the graph or the diagram, here is that boundary range that we're in. Right? So what I've got, just as a quick first sample, is several applications. The first one we'll do is the basic app. All of them are going to deploy rich copy in different configurations. So here, just a basic deployment. I want to make sure, obviously, that the content is in place on my distribution point. So I can do that looking content locations, and in fact, it is installed on my distribution point. Right? So I'm just going to go run this thing. So let me go to my client. And the first thing, since I'm doing the scenario I want to make sure the client downloads the content every time. So I need to make sure the cache folder is clean. So the client will have to go download it every time. Right? So I just cleared it out. So we're going to go run this thing. And the client should download it and install it just fine. Since I just purged the cache, the client actually will fail to locate the content the first time. And then when I do it again, it will go find it on the DP. So let me just click install. We'll see it go to failed. And there it is. I'll retry it, and here we're going to go find it. We're downloading, and off we go. Installing should be done in just a minute. So what I'm going to do is take you directly into the logs for the client and jump immediately to the portion of the logs where we're actually looking for the content. So let me get there real quick. Now, depending on the way you're requesting for content, your entry point to locating the content might be different. So for example, if you're running an application, the component that starts that process up is different than the component for a package, is different than the component for software update, is different than the component for OSD. But the nice thing is they all go into the same sections of code, the same processes for looking up content. So ultimately they will all end up calling into a piece called CAS, Content Access Service. When you're looking in these logs, keeping track of time is really, really helpful. So I'm going to open up CAS and go immediately to the start of the processing loop that I just had, which is going to be up here somewhere. There we go. So here's a natural break, right? So now let me just talk you through this. I'm not going to take you through every single line here. I will take you through the first time and show you more detail how this thing works end to end. But then for the next demos, I'll just take you to the bottom line. So when we open up CAS, remember, Content Access Service, that's the name of it, is looking for the content. The content either is going to be in the cache already from a previous download, or it's going to be something we need to go get on the network. If it's in the cache already, then we're just going to use it there. We're going to point to the cache, say, go execute it from here, right? If it's not in the cache, that's where we have to go out to the distribution point, look up the distribution points that are available to us, and then download the content, which is why I made sure I deleted the content from the cache. I don't want it to go to the cache, right? So you see that process. We're going to go, try to find a match in the cache. We're not going to find anything. We're going to then request content right here. Here's the content ID, and this is interesting. Let me take a diversion here real quick. So you might not know that we're actually working on rich copy right here, but we are, right? In the logs, we really don't tell you, hey, I'm working on rich copy or whatever the name is. We do in some cases, but most often it's by ID. Well, it's easy enough to actually map this to the ID in the console. Let me show you. So if you go over to deployment type and then go over to content ID, you can see the GUID, and you know that this is the exact content that we're trying to operate on, right? Little tangent there. So then I'm going to scroll on down to the real meat of this, and we'll arrive at a place that we say requesting locations, and then we're going to see our location requests go up. So this is a realization by CAS that we don't have it in the cache, and we need to go get it. So we're going to go through the processing to go get it. So what you'll see is the request sent up, and then the reply come back. Well, you might not look at this and realize that this is actually a transaction that goes to the management point, to the database, back to the management point, and back to the client. It all happens within the span of a single second, right? Very quick. But just looking at it, you wouldn't realize that. Perhaps you could dig through other logs and see it, right? But it actually does. I'll show you the pathway in just a minute. So here, we see the location request. We see a lot of detail that's very interesting to us. We can track what's going on. Here's the content, right? Here's the version that we're actually going to pull. Here's all the details about how we want to use it. Are we going to use protected DPs? Are we going to use HTTP allowed, SMB? Are we going to use all of these things, right? And then here's the IP information, IP subnet information the client's sending up for matching. Again, why are we sending up IPs? Because ultimately we're trying to return all of the DPs that are local to us, our preferred DPs, right? There is provision to return non-preferred DPs if you allow for that, which you haven't seen that yet. I'll show it to you in a minute. But here we're going to look for preferred DPs based on the IPs that we send up. So when we do this, at this stage, we're actually going to send this to the management point. So let me open the logs in the management point, and we'll look at the time, 8:45:38. So I'll open that up. I'm going to go to the primary site that manages this client, where this client's assigned. Okay, that's the primary site. I'm going to go into the management point folder, management point/client folder, and I'm looking for a log called mp_location. To see this detail, again, you need to have verbose and debug logging turned on. So I'm going to open it up, and I'm going to go up to the start of our transaction, again, following the timestamp. It's right around here. Right here. So you see the times exactly match. Right? Sorry, let me get the other log in focus here. You see the times exactly match between. So if I scroll down, you see the MP site code. You see the request coming in. Windows 8-2 is my client. Different information. Here's the location, or the location request coming in exactly like you see it expressed down below, and then we break it apart and start looking for things, right? Sorry, spreading out detail about what we're looking for. Then we enter this line. So you see calling mp_get get local sites from assigned site. So what this is a stored procedure that the management point is going to run against the database to get site information. Then we're going to do a little bit more and come down here to another stored procedure, mp_get content dp info unprotected, right? So we want to know what DPs match, and we're going to run that stored procedure, and if we get a response, we're going to reply with a distribution point. So this is the response information, meaning that we found a DP that matches. Right? So if I close that out and go back to my content reply, this is the exact reply. So I'll see all sorts of neat information, like the content flags, the hash algorithm, the hash value being returned, hash string being returned. Then I will see information about IP address again. I'll see the DP name that we're able to service. And then notice down here, this little tag says locality of this DP is local, which simply means this distribution point is a distribution point that is defined by my boundary group that I'm associated with. So it is, by definition, a preferred DP. Therefore, we can use it and download it, and everything's fine. Right? Now, I've located the content. Now I've got to go get the content, which is downloading it, and that's where we introduce Content Transfer Manager, Data Transfer Service, and all of that, and ultimately return control back to the calling process to go run the content once we have it downloaded. Right? But that's the process of content location. Now, why does it matter that you know this? Because you will inevitably have to troubleshoot some scenarios with content distribution to your clients and different things. In most cases, it works just fine. But in many cases that I've seen, the culprit for content not arriving at your clients, or better said, the culprit for applications not running, or packages not running, or software updates not running, is because we can't find a location to pull the content from. It's just simply a failed location request. Now, could be that we forgot to deploy it to the distribution point, or there's a problem deploying it to the distribution point. These kind of log entries will help surface that to you. Could also be that maybe you are not in the boundaries of a local DP, which either is that the boundaries aren't configured correctly, and you can kind of figure out, get a hint of that by looking at the local versus fallback designation that I have highlighted. Or it could be that your system that you're trying to manage is traveling. It's not in its location. You wouldn't expect it to get the content because of the way the content's configured. Right? Again, more on that in a minute. So anyway, that's why it's important. This knowing this process can help you troubleshoot a number of issues that are related. All right, so let me pull the client back out of the picture for a minute, and let's talk about the next scenario here. So the second scenario will be fallback. So in order to understand what I'm going to do, let me go through how I'm going to reconfigure the lab real quick. So you notice that the same boundary range is in place on our primary one and our DP, but I have no boundary range at all associated with PR2. My client's IP address is exactly the same. There's no match at all over here. It's still assigned to PR2. But since I don't have any matching boundary groups that have my boundaries, I, by definition, am now in a mode called fallback. Right? So in a fallback scenario, clients, by default, will not be able to retrieve content. It's up to you whether you want to enable fallback, and I'll show you how you do it now. So let me first get the labs, make sure the lab is configured and set up right. So what I need to do is deinstall rich copy, because I want to be able to install it again. So we go to Control Panel, Programs and Features and do that. Rich copy uninstall should be quick. And then I want to go and force the client to realize that rich copy actually isn't installed, so we can go install it again. So I'll do that in the Config Manager applet and run my app deployment cycle, and off we go. So you should see it adjust. In fact, I think I just saw it move around in the back. Now, another thing I need to do, because again, I don't want the content to come at all from the cache, and it shouldn't, but I'm just paranoid, is I'm going to go into the cache folder and delete it. Right? Now, the reason it shouldn't in this case is because I have distinct applications and so distinct downloaded content, but still I want to make sure it's deleted. So let me get rid of it. This is my rich copy. Yes, it is. So let me get rid of that, and then I won't have to worry about it. It'll just download again. Now, in this case, what I want to do is enable the support for fallback. Let me get rid of that, minimize this. Okay, here's my demonstration for fallback that I'm going to try to run. But in order to configure fallback, I need to make some changes on the site. So fallback, again, as I mentioned, by default is not supported. It's not enabled. The way you enable fallback is in two places, really, actually three, but two locations where there's a checkbox that says enable fallback. The first is on the distribution point itself. So if I look at the properties of my local distribution point, if I look at the properties of my local distribution point, I will see Boundary Groups tab, and here you see an option, Allow Fallback Source Location for Content. By default, this is enabled, right? In my case, I've turned it off because I don't want this to be a fallback source location, right? But by default, it's enabled. Okay. Oops, did I look at the right one? Sorry, this is PR. I jumped ahead. This is PR1. Here, I do want this to be a fallback source location, so I left it alone. We're enabled. Okay. I'll talk to you more about the one that wasn't enabled in just a minute. Right. So the client's distribution point from its assigned site is enabled for fallback. So that's cool, right? So I mentioned there's two switches that have to be turned on. One of them is turned on by default. The second switch is on the individual content, and that one is turned off by default. So if I go to Software Library, go to my application, you'll see fallback. Let me just do this the right way. Go to Properties and then go to Deployment Types, just all the way through. And then if I go to Content, you'll see Allow Clients to use a fallback source location for content. This is disabled by default. All right. So if you want to enable fallback, meaning that in my scenario, my client's allowed to go to my local distribution point even though it's not in a boundary group, I have to turn both of these on. Then there's a third setting. Notice this deployment option below. Select the deployment option to use when a client is within a slow or unreliable network boundary. Again, that part is definable by the boundary selection and DP selection on the boundary group, or when the client uses a fallback source location for content. So the default option here is do not download the content. So even if you enable fallback and go with the default here, it's not going to work because you're not allowed to download the content. That's why I had to choose this one. Now, another trick to this, the settings that I make on the DP, the settings that I make on the boundary group, those implement very quickly. If I were to do the changes on the application, and if my lab were to, if my samples were to have used the same application all the way through, I would have had to wait for policy updates to change the config of the app itself, which is why I went with 3 separate applications but the same software that I'm trying to install. Right? One requires one requires policy updates, the other doesn't. So I don't have to wait as long. All right, so let's go run this and see what happens. So first time again, it will fail because of the changes, and we'll try it again. Downloading, off we go, installing, and let's go look in the log and see what happened. So keeping track of timestamp, I'm just going to search for reply and go directly to it. And here we are. And this time, we have a locality that's different. It is specifying fallback. Again, everything else looks exactly the same. But here we clearly see that the client recognizes I don't have access to my preferred DPs. I don't know who my preferred DPs are because I don't have a boundary group that I'm matching with my boundary. But because of my configuration where I'm allowing fallback, I'm able to run. If fallback were not enabled, the client just would never run it because it doesn't know where to go, right? All right. So again, pretty similar, but I think definitely worth showing. Okay. So let me pull the lab out. I'll have to make a few adjustments to set it for the next scenario in just a minute, but let's look at the third scenario, which is distribute on demand. So for distribute on demand, here's the way the lab's going to be configured. Again, PR2, my DP, I don't have any boundaries or boundary groups associated with the range that this client's on. So client hasn't changed, still assigned to PR2. Here's the IP address. But notice I've moved the range that the client matches over to PR1 and the DP. So this is, again, a roaming type scenario. Just like with PR2, it was kind of a remote roaming scenario. The client really didn't know where to go. It didn't match the boundary group anywhere, so we allowed fallback. It went back to its home DP. Here we allow, or we put the boundary range over on another site. So this would be the equivalent of what used to be called local or global roaming or whatever. Right? So the client knows where it belongs, knows where it matches, and wants to try to use the local resources over there, but it's a different site code altogether. So let me go. All right, so let's go ahead and pull the lab back in, make the adjustments we need to get this done. So I'm going to start with the client. So I'm going to uninstall, make sure everything's uninstalled and such, so we don't have anything in the cache. Let me get rid of it. All right, looks like we're good to go as far as installing the application. And then let me make some adjustments on the site server to get the boundaries in line. So here's my boundary group number 1. I need to add in my boundary. All right, good enough. And then let's just explore the distribute on demand application and see how it's configured. Well, first of all, let me go back to the distribution point. Looks like I have to restart the console just real fast. No problem. So let's look at the distribution point just real fast. Back to administration, distribution points. So this is the one that we're going to treat as download on demand. So we want to make sure that the content actually is not present so that we will be able to validate that it was deployed out so we don't see any rich copy DoD out there. Okay, so we're good to go there. And just to validate, this one is not configured to allow fallback. All right. So let me pause here. So whenever you configure distribute on demand, or whenever you're configuring distribute on demand, fallback, that kind of thing, you have to make a choice whether you want your DP to participate in distribute on demand or participate in fallback. You can't have a DP that does both. So the question is, why can't you, right? And the answer is, with a DP that's configured for fallback, the expectation is that that DP could service requests from clients wherever, right? Whereas with distribute on demand or preferred DPs enabled, then the assumption is that only DPs that are tied to servicing just one particular boundary group will be DPs that participate. So because of that, you have to make a choice, one or another, for the DP itself. All right. Now, and on the deployment as well, on the application in this case, we have a couple of switches. So if we look in the properties of the Distribute on Demand app and look at our distribution settings, here's distribute the content in this package to preferred DPs. That's our setting for Distribute on Demand. And just to follow it through, this is not set for fallback support. So here we go. Right, everything else good to go. So now we need to go back to the client, and let me just show you again. I showed you a minute ago, but I'll show it to you again. Just to remind you, our client needs to learn that it's now within the boundary group of the new site, the primary one. And it looks like now we've learned that, right? So we should be good to go. Notice the difference. I showed you the screenshot of this a minute ago, and it only had an assigned management point. Now it has both an assigned and a resident management point. And that's because the client knows that it's boundary group that it matches now is this one over here with the primary 1, yet it's still assigned to primary 2 as its assigned site. So what we're going to try to do is leverage the distribution point, the management point, and such that's available locally. Now, so this is the place that I'll pause, and I'll mention it again in a minute, but I mentioned earlier that management point selection is done based on boundaries, and that's absolutely true. If you are inside the boundaries that are associated with the site systems of your assigned site, then we just randomly choose which management points, if there are multiple, to go to. But in this case, we're now being serviced in the boundary group that is associated with some the site systems associated with primary 1, so we're kind of roaming, right? So we are picking a local management point to use, even though our assigned management point doesn't change. We're still going to get our policies and instructions from our assigned management point, but we will try to leverage the local resources to actually execute that content for efficiency's sake. And that's the extent of boundaries really driving the selection of MPs. Again, it's not like DPs where we can pick one or the other based on boundary groups within a given site code. Right? All right, so let's go and try to run this thing. So here, distribute on demand, it should fail. Oops, sorry. Looks like I did not take this back. Let me just make sure I quickly do that and uninstall it. I mislooked at it. Okay, so programs and features, let's get rid of it. There's rich copy. Uninstall. Good enough, tell the client that it actually isn't here. Config manager, application deployment evaluation cycle, run. Alright, so all of that should be good to go. So here's our distribute on demand, and it's ready. So let's click install, and we should fail. Fail, let's try it again, and we fail again. So now if we follow it through, so in the previous examples, the second failure worked, right? There was no second failure because we figured out the cache was cleared and different things. So now if we follow in the log and go with our timestamp, let's just search up for the results. So search up, and we're just going to search for reply. And notice what we get, right? The request is exactly the same. The reply, though, does not return a distribution point, right? So this is a scenario where we look for a distribution point and we don't have one. And if we did not have distribute on demand turned on, that would be the extent of it. But here we have distribute on demand turned on, and the client then has the ability to go request that the content be provisioned proactively since it's not there and we asked for it. So let's continue following this up. So let's look at the management point logs. All right, back up a level. Go to the management point. This is on the primary site that owns it. Actually, this is the primary site that the client is talking to now, not the primary site that the client's assigned to, but the primary 1. Why? Because we're talking to the management point on primary 1. So that's where we'll see some of the activity. So let's go into the logs folder here and go into mp_location. Here that is, and here we go. All right, so we'll see it right here. We found we can trace it with the timestamp, but here we have no locations found. Right? We were looking for MPs or DPs that we could use. We don't have any. So what we're going to do is send up a demand request to cause the content to be provisioned, right? And then we're going to send back a reply that, hey, we don't have a DP right now. Well, that demand request is going to go actually to the site server into the distribution manager inbox, and distribution manager will process that and proactively deliver content. So let's follow that through. So again, this is on primary 1. Here we go, logs, distribution manager. Right here, and so if we look, the log should be up to date, and we should be able to search upward for demand and find the activity. And right here it is. we found a demand file. We're going to process that. We're going to start sending the content out to primary 1, right here. And at this stage, we should have the content on primary 1. Let me go check that out and see. So if we look back at our content here now, or let me just look at the DP view. That's where we looked at it before. So if we just look at our primary 1 DP and the content that's out there, in fact, we do have the distribute on demand content out there now. And if we go back to the client and run it, again, it should work. Right? Waiting, downloading, good to go. And that's it, right? So that's the 3. That's basic, that's fallback, that's distribute on demand. For distribute on demand, though, think of the implications, right? So if you do have a client, well, first of all, if you don't want to, if you know where you want to place the content, distribute on demand is not going to help you. But if you want to have a fail-safe to make sure the content's in place, if you want to just send the content to a certain group of DPs and not necessarily absorb the network traffic of additional DPs unless you have clients in those boundary groups requesting the content, then distribute on demand is perfect, right? So in this case, I'm triggering the content manually, but if you're in an automated scenario or required scenario, the client gets the policy and normally would be in the boundary group to run it, but then for some reason is traveling or maybe the boundaries are misconfigured or whatever, and it comes runtime, then we're going to request it. It's not going to be there. We're going to automatically provision it, and we're going to succeed, right? So anyway, so now it's installed. All right, so let me pull the lab back out of the picture, and let's wrap up here. So the last thing is, again, boundaries and MP lookup. I've already shown you a bit about how that works and talked about the fact that whenever it comes to deciding what kind of MP we're going to use, local or once we're in the final configuration and we have a choice of MPs that we're going to use, then we're always going to prefer the local resource versus the assigned, right? So top down, when we're deciding what MP to use, the first preference is one that's in a local forest versus one that's in a remote forest. Then from there, we're going to prefer secure socket layer enabled MPs versus HTTP MPs. And from there, once we get to HTTP MPs, the selection is totally random within a site. But like I just showed you, if we're in a boundary group that is really pulling us to a resource or an MP, making available MPs, DPs from another site, then we're going to prefer to use local resources versus assigned, right, for our primary MP. We'll always still get the instructions and such, policy and such from our assigned MP, but the local resource is able to serve our location requests and things like that. All right, so that wraps up our tour of boundaries. Hopefully this was interesting for both those that are experienced with boundaries and those that are new. We'll see you next time.